Happy Friday, everybody. James Hancock here. My movie going this weekend just got off to a great start. I decided to check out the new Netflix movie Gerald's Game, based on the 1992 novel by Stephen King. This fall really is turning into the fall of Stephen King. Between it shattering records at the box office and now Gerald's Game on Netflix, a movie that I think is a very solid Stephen King adaptation. I mean, we're seeing some of the best Stephen King adaptations we've seen in years. I recently had the privilege of speaking about Stephen King at the recent Kevin Geeks Out at the Nighthawk Cinema here in Brooklyn, and he's got an upcoming show in Yonkers in the very near future, so go to kevingeeksout.com if you want to see a live show about Stephen King adaptations. But Gerald's Game was a bit of a blind spot for me going into this because my knowledge of Stephen King's books rests primarily in his books from Carrie through around The Dark Half, although I have read books that came out after that period, like Wizard and Glass, which I absolutely love. But I tend to lean toward his earlier work, and for whatever reason, Gerald's Game came out right at the pivot point where I stopped reading every single book that he was writing. And also, as a teenager, the idea of reading a book about somebody handcuffed to their bed for 700 pages didn't really set my world on fire. So I gave it a pass for a very long time. But I'm thrilled to now have this adaptation to enjoy. This was my first exposure to director Mike Flanagan. I was totally oblivious. I mean, I was aware of his movies like Ouija, Origin of Evil, and Hush, and Oculus, but I hadn't seen any of his movies, so I might have to do a little digging through the back bins and see some of his earlier movies. But the real pleasure of watching Gerald's Game was to get to see Carla Gugino in action. I've had a massive crush on Carla Gugino for a very long time. She's been phenomenal in so many movies. But this premise is really an ideal showcase for her talents because it's basically a one-person show. Granted, she has a co-star in Bruce Greenwood to interact with for a lot of the story, but for the most part, this is a story through Carla Gugino's perspective. And if you don't know what the premise is, it's a very simple one. Carla Gugino's character and her husband, played by Bruce Greenwood, are suffering from some marital struggles, and they're an aging couple without any children, and they decide to go to a house in the woods that's very removed and very far away from any close neighbors or anything like that, in order to have a nice, potentially kinky sexual weekend where they get to know each other again. They decide to experiment with a little bit of bondage, because even with the Viagra, her husband is having a little trouble performing as of late. And then this kinky little sex game goes totally wrong because he has a heart attack in the middle of the process, falls to the floor dead, and now the question is, what can she do to try and survive long enough where she might potentially be discovered, or can she take action and try and save herself? But there are a few additional wrinkles. I mean, as she starts to get dehydrated, she starts to hallucinate, so she drifts in and out of visions. And meanwhile, she has a carnivorous dog that is feasting on her husband's remains and is starting to look at her very hungrily. And she's also being stalked by this supernatural death-like figure. Now, before I go into any spoilers, I'll just say I thought this movie was an excellent base hit. Is it a home run? Probably not. I mean, it's not a Stephen King adaptation that I'm going to watch 150,000 times like I did Brian De Palma's Carrie, or David Cronenberg's The Dead Zone, or Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Those are major Stephen King adaptations that have become genuine bona fide classics. That said, if Netflix wants to keep cranking out kick-ass horror movies like this on a regular basis, I'm totally in, because not only did the movie scare the shit out of me, even though I was watching it in broad daylight, it gave me these really evil chills at the end that I haven't felt that level of a creepy vibe in a very long time. But I'll be getting into my reasons why when I get to my spoilers. So last warning now, I think it's time to get into some specifics. But if you're into horror and if you're into Stephen King, definitely check out Gerald's Game on Netflix. All right, so let's get into some details. What I love about this is that when it comes to story construction and you're dealing with a survival scenario, and this is basically 127 hours, but for horror fans, but I feel like it's really annoying when filmmakers and or novelists suddenly introduce things to save characters if details or hints of those solutions have not at least been teased early on in the story. And as this story unfolds, even if it seems like a completely hopeless scenario, all the information is there like a trail of breadcrumbs leading us to where Carla Gugino's options are going to be in order to try and survive. But while this story ostensibly is just a tale of survival, there's a hell of a lot more going on as well, because we learn that Carla Gugino's character has a history of being sexually molested by her father, something she has not fully come to terms with, and that she's going to need to face some of those unresolved emotions in order to get through this experience, because these experiences are roaring back to the surface now that she's hallucinating. She's going to have to come to terms with the, at least at times, toxic relationship she was developing with her husband, because even if they are trying to make things work, he was being unfaithful, and some of these kinky sex games involving submission and domination she is not remotely into, and she's starting to fear and be disgusted by this man that she is married to. And then the last layer is this death-like apparition who is haunting her. And initially, as the story unfolds, you think that basically as she's getting closer to death, that she's essentially being visited by the Grim Reaper. He's this ominous, terrifying figure with exaggerated features with a giant bag of bones as well as jewelry. And speaking of bag of bones, that was a very interesting reference to yet another Stephen King property. And along those lines, there's even a reference to Cujo at one point. So for people who like their interconnected Stephen King universe, this movie is sprinkled with those little details. But what's fascinating about these dual struggles that our character is going through, it allows the story to jump back and forth between these various conflicts, so you're not constantly just being abused and tormented by the physical reality of her situation. Sometimes you're exploring her flashbacks of her abusive father. Sometimes you're exploring her relationship with her husband, because his ghost, for lack of a better term, keeps taunting her and talking to her, while at the same time she receives advice from essentially an avatar of herself, or she's facing down this gruesome figure of death. So it gives us a lot of variety in terms of what she's facing. And then throughout it all, you always have this goddamn dog who is eating her husband at the floor, and whenever the dog feels as if Carla Gugino is drifting into sleep, he'll start licking her toes and or biting her foot and basically trying to get the fresher meat. One quick side note though, Carla Gugino and Bruce Greenwood, I don't know who their trainers are or what their diet might be, but they are in remarkable physical condition, considering that I think Carla Gugino's in her mid-40s or late 40s, and Bruce Greenwood's more than 60, yet they are clearly not skipping any days at the gym. They both look great, which initially I was thinking, Carla Gugino is so muscular and so strong, why don't she just snap those bedposts? I mean, she looks like she could just break the bed in two. If you remember, she also plays Silk Spectre in The Watchmen, where she looked like she could run through a brick wall. But luckily, they did throw in this little line about how the bedposts have been reinforced internally, so I could stop thinking about that. But yeah, she's so damn fit. Looks like she could just go boink and just do some curls and pop right out. In any case, she is definitely stuck. Her hands are growing increasingly insensitive, and then also the dehydration's making her weaker and weaker as time goes by. But for a horror movie to be effective, I feel like it has to at least terrify you once or twice, and at other times possibly sicken you. And this movie terrified me twice, and it sickened me once. So I feel like mission accomplished. I mean, the first time I saw this figure of death sitting in the corner of the room, my heart about stopped. When it came to sickening revulsion, there's a scene where there's a flashback to Carla Gugino as a teenager being convinced to sit in her father's lap to watch a solar eclipse while he masturbates behind her. I mean, it is genuinely fucked up territory, especially the way he tries to guilt trip her into keeping it a secret after the fact. There's a scene of genuine hardcore gore that about made me pass out while watching it. I mean, Carla Gugino eventually, and this is massive spoilers, so I apologize in advance if you don't want this detail, but bail out if you don't want it. But she finally figures out that the way to escape is to basically slit her wrists with glass that she has from a glass of water on the table above her, and that using the slick blood, she'll be able to pull her hand through the cuff. But it's not like she just wets her hand with blood and slides it through. She cuts her hand in a way so that as she's pulling her hand through the cuffs, it basically peels all the flesh up and over her hand like a glove. I mean, I was freaking the fuck out watching this, just like, oh my god, it was way grosser than anything I'd expected or anticipated. But that's not the scene that really shook me. The scene that really shook me at the end is as her character's going through recovery and she's regaining the use of her hand, learning to adjust to the new normal as she describes it, she learns in the newspaper that this figure of death who's been stalking her is actually a real guy. They're calling him the Crypt Keeper, but his whole thing is that he likes to have sex with and or dismember and steal from dead people, and that basically he was waiting for her to die so that he could take some of her belongings and or pieces of her body. As I was exposed to this revelation, I just got the most evil chills and waves going up and down my back and arms. I mean, I could not believe how creepy this was, especially as they elaborate on the laundry list of crimes and atrocities that he's been committing in the area. So suffice to say, I'm a fan. The movie was far superior to anything that I was anticipating. And when it comes to Netflix original programming, when it comes to movies, not TV shows, but just the movies they've produced, this might be my favorite Netflix movie that I've seen. Granted, I am not an expert on all the original content. Netflix, they crank out so much original content, I can't even begin to keep up with it. I tend to watch a lot of their comedy specials and a handful of their shows. But this is the first feature film they've made where I realize they are beating the Hollywood movie studios at their own game. It's yet another excellent horror movie to enjoy this fall. And with Halloween right around the corner, I feel like we all should be increasing our steady diet of great horror flicks. So I strongly recommend Gerald's Game if you have a taste for this kind of material. I hope you enjoyed my review and reactions, and I hope you'll consider giving my channel a subscribe. But I hope everyone has an awesome weekend. Give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax if you want to talk more, and I'll be back at y'all Sunday night to review the next episode of Star Trek. Talk to y'all soon.